Well, hey there, idiots. Welcome back to Observe. In today's video, it's going to be part one of a two-part series, or at least that's what I'm expecting it to be, is a two-part series around the case of Robert Durst. This first half will be building much of the baseline, understanding some of the specific characteristics to Durst, and then the final one will be analyzing some of the areas where he has shown cracks in his fairly interesting nonverbal communication. More on that in a bit. Let's go ahead and roll the intro. Just for those of you who are watching this, I will let you know this is going to be dark in areas, so just be aware of that. This is true crime, and as is true crimes want, it usually has some dark instances, so just be aware of that as you continue forward. But let's go ahead and talk about the backstory. Robert Durst is an heir to a massive real estate fortune and has been arrested in connection to the murder of his friend Susan Berman way back in 2000. While the only charges he's facing currently are in regards to Burman's murder, he has also been suspected of being involved in at least two other crimes as well. The disappearance of his former wife, whose name is Kathleen or Kathy McCormack, and also the killing and dismemberment of Morris Black, who was his neighbor. However, he was acquitted of Black's murder back in 2003, and the following is a brief synopsis of Durst's timeline. In 1973, Robert Durst was married to Kathy McCormack. Then, in 1980, they split and lived in separate apartments, and Durst began to date another woman. Then, in 1982, McCormack went missing after a party and a call from Durst. Her friend mentioned that McCormack had been afraid, quote-unquote, of what Durst would do to her. Later on in 2000, after years of stagnation, investigators decided to reopen the case of her disappearance. Police set out to question Susan Berman, who was a close friend of Durst's at the time, but they found her in her home, fatally shot execution style. They questioned Durst in regards to that murder, but he was never charged. Now we're in 2001. While her body was never found in the last 19 years, McCormack was declared dead. In the same year, Durst was arrested and charged for the murder of an elderly neighbor of his, whose name was Morris Black. The investigators were alerted to the murder when the body parts that belonged to Black were found floating in Galveston Bay in Texas. Durst became a fugitive after missing a court hearing, but was later apprehended with 2 guns in his possession and also Black's driver's license as well. In 2003, the trial for Black ensued, and Durst's lawyers offered this argument that he acted in self-defense. However, he also admitted fully and upfront to dismembering and disposing of Black's body parts. Since the prosecution was unable to disprove that the moment of Black's death was in self-defense, Durst was acquitted of the murder. In 2004, he pled guilty on 2 counts of bond jumping, 1 count of tampering with evidence, and as part of a plea agreement was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Now in 2005, he was again paroled, but was then returned to jail after violating the terms of his parole by visiting the home where he was alleged to have murdered Black. Later on in 2015, the Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst documentary premiered on HBO in February. In March, the LA District Attorney reopened the Burman case due to some new evidence that was made clear by the documentary in the form of 2 separate letters, each with the same handwriting and spelling mistake. Along with this, the end of the Jinx documentary revealed what seemed to be an audio confession by Durst. Now, in 2017, a hearing took place in which a close friend of Durst said that Durst had confessed to killing Burman. Another hearing was set for October of 2017, but was postponed to accommodate Durst's defense team. Now, let's talk about 2018. A judge ruled that there was enough evidence to try Durst for the murder of Susan Berman, but during his court appearance, Durst pleaded not guilty. Later in 2019, the judge set Durst's trial date for the 3rd of September in 2019, but it was postponed again due to the conflict in the attorney schedules and how much evidence there was for this case. Now in 2020, Durst appeared in court to begin the trial proceedings, but everything was again halted due to the pandemic. More postponements ensued until the judge made a final postponement until April of 2021, unless Durst agreed to a bench trial without a jury, which he refused. However, the trial was again postponed from April 12th to May 17th of 2021. Now, let's talk about 2021 here. His lawyers attempted to postpone the trial indefinitely due to Durst having bladder cancer and asked to even release him on bail in order to receive medical treatment for said cancer. However, the motion was denied and the trial resumed on May 17th. On June 10th, Durst was hospitalized, but the judge reconvened the trial on June 14th. Later on the 28th, Durst's younger brother testified that he believed that Durst wanted to kill him and that he even went so far as to hire a private security team to protect him from what he believed Durst could do. In August, the 78-year-old Durst began testifying in his own defense. He denied killing Burman and he said he did not know who did. Shortly ago, here in September of 2021, a guilty verdict was announced after roughly 7.5 hours of deliberations. The case stretched across nearly 40 years, beginning with the sinister disappearance of Kathleen McCormack back in 1982 and concluded with a verdict of an execution-style murder. While closure has come for some in the case, the McCormack family is still wanting to see more efforts being pushed into the investigation of Kathy's disappearance. So that's where everything is with the case so far. So I spent a lot of time poring over footage of Durst to see what I could see in his nonverbal communication, and it was very, very fascinating. Like I said, today is going to be split up into 2 separate episodes. We're going to have the first half of this long interview, and then we're going to have the second half on a different day that has everything coming to fruition at the full pinnacle of everything. But I think that's going to be enough talking. Now it is time to dive into the analysis. Actually, before that, I just want to let you know, you'll see this. It shows that there are portions of this that have only the audio, and that's to avoid infringing on copyright from the documentary itself. So just be aware of that. I included as much as I could. This is not the full interview. I do suggest you go and watch other material outside of this as well. Let's go.
What do you see as the downside to sitting down and doing an interview? And what do you see as the upside?
So this little piece here, the question, it helps me understand a little bit of what Durst's baseline might be. Right now, there's not really any incriminating questions. There's nothing that would make him feel nervous or agitated or in any way worried about being caught out. So that's going to help me understand how he just behaves in an interview situation without the questions being bad for him. And so with that, we could see that he maintains largely open nonverbal communication across his body with his fairly relaxed position in the chair, arms on the chair, sometimes gesturing. And then in regards to his face, from what I'm seeing, he has overall a fairly emotive face. He has the ability to move his eyebrows, his lower half of his face down here fully emotes. The thing that does strike me as interesting is how consistently neutral his eyes seem to stay, and his upper eyelids are a little fuller, which means that might make it a little bit more difficult for me to see some of the smaller muscle movements that might pop up into those to help me understand. His blink rate seems to be fairly average, and so far there's nothing to be alerted to for tics or anything along those lines. I will actually let you know though, since this isn't my first time going through this footage, he does have a tic that regularly comes up to where he squinches his face, he'll close his eyes tightly and crinkle his nose. And that comes up regularly. And today I hope to be able to break down why that comes up. If it's just a tic, perhaps it is, there's nothing he can do about it, or if there is a psychological reason behind it. We'll have to figure that out as we continue. So let's do that.
Night that your mother died.
My father came and got me, and he said, "I'd like you to come on over here. I want you to, see Mommy." And we looked out a hall window out onto the roof, and there was Mommy. And I waved at Mommy. I don't know that she saw me. It never went through my mind that, what is she doing out on the roof in her nightie? Yeah, I mean, it just didn't focus on me. There's Mommy, wave at Mommy. Okay, now go on back to bed. All of a sudden, I heard the maid shouting, "She's off the roof." It was a long, long fall. 4 adults who were there reported that she fell. Whether they reported that because they didn't want to say she committed suicide, I have no idea. I never forgot it. I mean, it happened. I was there. I saw it. Whatever I saw, it never left me. I went.
Okay. So the reason that I left this part in here is because it allows us to see him talk about even just maybe a semi-traumatic event in his past. Now, the reason that I say it's semi-traumatic is not because seeing your parent just before their death is not traumatic. It's because of the distance of time. So he's much older now, and he's talking about something that happened when he was 5-ish or so. So there's a lot of time. So that time removal is going to make things a little bit more fuzzy for me to be able to see, but it does allow me to maybe see if anything could pop up around agitation or stress in a traumatic event. So that way, if down the road there's an area where I've seen these tells of trauma or stress come up in an area where they shouldn't be, then it's a red flag, and I could pay attention to it and hone in on it. So during that time, if you pay attention to his face, it emotes rather averagely. There's nothing that's sticking out of him being like, oh, well, it's a desynchronization. He really does emote rather averagely, if a little bit neutral on his general expression. However, he does have a little bit of a tic tendency, if that makes sense. He does have those odd, tiny twinges of facial movements that I'm not necessarily convinced are related to anything of importance yet. But you saw at the very, very end there, he does his pretty substantial blink, a little lip compression, swallow mixed with the nose wrinkle in there. That does come up regularly. Whether it's a tic or a tell will have to be determined as the video goes on.
Went to the funeral. I mean, if you ever have an opportunity, which you're better off not taking a 7-year-old child to a funeral, that was a disaster. People are telling me, your mommy will be safe, she'll be right here. And they're starting to lower the coffin into the ground. And I'm going, wait a minute, Mommy's in this box? Oh yes, she'll be right here. Get Mommy out of the box. I don't want Mommy in the box. And I jumped out and tried to stop the guys from lowering this box into the ground.
I want to point out some things that are happening with his tone during this part. You can hear his normal average baseline tone, but then in this area where he's talking about this agitated moment, or the people even speaking to him in that agitated moment, it becomes quite clear that his pitch will increase when in regards to agitation. So that's just something that we can note, that for him, he does happen to stick at least loosely to that rule of an increase in pitch and tone can indicate agitation, as we've seen it clustered here. So also, I want to note in this part where he leans back and he's doing like the oopsie uh-oh thing, right before he says, get Mommy out of the box, that portion there, that pops up almost exactly multiple times throughout his interview. And it feels like it's a switch in emotion for him. That specific nonverbal cluster is a whole switch in emotion for him. And you'll see that pop up multiple areas, and we'll talk more about what that actually can mean as the video continues. So let's continue.
After that, they had a big problem with me because I would run away. When they took me to school, I would run away. At home, I would run away. A number of times I had to call the police to go find me. I would just run away and go hide somewhere.
Did your dad do any?
Interesting. His tone has dropped now from the heightened pitch before all the way down to this much lower, much more gravelly tone. And that could be in relation to the somberness. Usually that drop that you can hear in a person's tone is in relation to a negative emotion of some form. Very rarely are people going to drop their tone when they're very excited about something. So when we hear that tone drop, that does line up rather well. Now, here's the thing, is that in nonverbal communication, context is going to be the most important thing you can keep in mind as you read it. Because for instance, in this situation, his tone drops. And I do believe that that's in regards to the emotional weight behind his words. He started causing problems, and he was a problem child, and this fall off happens. Now, that makes more sense contextually. However, in nonverbal communication, a fall off in pitch and quality of tone like that can also indicate a possible lack of confidence in those words. That doesn't make sense in this area. I don't think he's lacking confidence in him talking about how he behaved as a child, so it makes more sense in context. So I hope this is making sense, and this is kind of what you have to do as you navigate an analysis, a nonverbal analysis, something like this. You have to keep note of the tells that happen, when they happen, why they happen, and then consider that in the context of everything else to be able to get the most accurate tell you can. Unfortunately, in YouTube videos, that gets cut awfully short because there's a lot of behind the scenes work that will go into that to get to that moment of, I know this tell means this. So that's where you might run into these issues, especially on YouTube, with nonverbal analysts disagreeing, is because, frankly, there's not enough time to be able to dedicate to each individual case as if it were the professional, full laid out quality that you would like it to. So just keep that in mind, especially even while watching my stuff, there is that room for error. And even if I were on the top of my game and absolutely perfect, our understanding of nonverbal communication is still limited due to its science. So there is still always a possibility that I could be wrong in there. So just please keep that in mind as we continue forward. I'm going to try to let you know everything about the process of this as I continue forward. So let's do that.
Anything to make up for the disappearance of your mother in your life? Did he say, well, now I'm going to come home more frequently, or I'm going to change?
He never said that, and he did not. My father was not there like he should have been.
Did you confront your dad about it later on in your life?
Oh, I confronted him with the whole thing, way back when I got 12, 13, 14.
And what was his response?
He wouldn't go there.
Okay, so during that time we saw Durst's tick, his heavy blink and crinkle nose come up a couple times. And I wanted to make note of when those came up. Each time that has really substantially cropped up has been around a possible area of agitation, of stress, and be it anger, be it sadness, be it fear, too early to tell, but there is agitation that's occurring, and because of that, he has that specific tick come out. And then also speaking on his tone and the verbal patterns and the recollection of his father. His father behaved a very specific way, and from what I can understand, not very well towards the family, even down to the point that Durst referred to his father as Seymour, which is his name, rather than Dad, which, I mean, every family dynamic has some differences, but on top of that, the way that Durst talks about how his father interacted is also very negative, and then that he wouldn't go there. That really sharp drop off at the end of his sentence is a little bit dramatic, and it is, I don't know if the word is sinister that I'm looking for, but Durst is really trying to show that the way that Seymour handled it was bad, and his tone is reflecting that. So once again, we have to keep in mind that when Durst is talking about something that is bad or negative, he might drop his tone off, and that could be the tell contextually. So far, there's been 2 instances of tone drop-offs in regard to the emotional state, and none so far that seem to be in relation to the confidence state. So that's kind of what we're understanding here. Let's continue forward.
Kathy's mother was very interested in Bob Durst liking me, and Bob Durst conversing with me. Her favorite reading material was the magazine Yankee, the New England thing, and she would want to talk to me about the articles in Yankee. And I'm not interested in talking about canning.
These experiences with her.
Interesting. Okay, so in this part, a few things come to light. First, Durst will refer to himself, and does regularly throughout much of his footage, in the third person. However, from what I saw in other areas, is that is often in response to somebody saying, hey, so imagine, like, how does, in this case, Kathy's mom feel about Robert Durst, about you? And then he would respond, well, she was really concerned with how Robert Durst would like her, that sort of thing. So he'll pop into that third person point of view, which is just interesting, that psychological separation between him and the previous him, or him doing things, or the character him almost. Just a fascinating element of his psychology. And then while he's talking about what Kathy's mom enjoys, you could see on the side of his nose there a little bit of disgust starting to creep in. And it lingers, changing and morphing as he talks about how he's not interested in canning. And that really does let us know that he can show the emotion of disgust on his face in relation to something that is, in his eyes, disgusting, which is canning. I mean, I've done a lot of canning and I don't find it that disgusting, but sure, okay. So we can see that happen. So that means that later on, that if we see that specific muscle group start to have activity in an area where it's not expected to be, it's a red flag, and we can cue in because we know that it can mean disgust. So just gathering more information. Let's continue pushing through the video.
Her family were kind of like Bob meets the average American family.
Well, more than meet, Bob is forced to spend time with the average American family. Bob is supposed to be polite and cooperative and pleasant and engage in the same conversations that they are, and I just couldn't do that. As we're going back,
still more and more disgust slipping through on the one side of his nose as he's talking about having to be around the average American family. And this really does put into perspective what Durst's opinion of himself was, is that he felt above the average American family, and he was very, very wealthy from a very young age. And that can always lead to complications in a child's life regardless, but to see him overtly show disgust towards the average American family really does put into perspective Durst's opinion of himself. He thought that he was much better than the average person. And I think that's an important portion of his entire demeanor. We'll talk more later on.
Back in the car, Kathy is crying and saying, they're all good people. They treated us with utmost respect. You can just put up with it for 2 hours.
Did you say I'll try?
I wouldn't talk about it.
Now we've seen a vocal pattern and a behavioral pattern between father and son. So last time that he was talking about his dad, he wouldn't go there, is I believe the exact words, he wouldn't go there, and dropped off in that tone. And it was about his dad making a decision that was self-centered and disregarding of other people. And now we have a moment where Kathy is upset at Durst for, more or less, from what I understand, being a terrible human being at this party. And he has the same tonal drop-off and behavioral pattern as his dad of answering in such a way that is dismissive of anybody else's opinion or feeling. He, more or less, wouldn't go there. So it's interesting that I'm seeing that tie between father and son so clearly painted here, and it's really helping me understand how Durst feels about himself.
If you were with Kathy's mother, what would you say?
I feel bad about the way I treated you. That you're a good person. I am complicit in Kathy's not being here.
What was the dynamic between you and
Okay, so during this part, his tone does increase. That she's a good person, that I'm sorry, like those things. It comes up and it's this pleading kind of tone that comes into his voice, but it's not replicated on his face in any way. So that's where it lends this disconnected feeling between it. And something that I noticed about Durst's behavior almost continually is that he would speak in such a way that he felt disconnected as the world was happening around him almost, and also how he observed things. I believe he truly felt himself separate from everything else around him, that he was special, maybe unique, or better even, as we saw earlier, than the people around him. And also during that time, while he was saying, I'm sorry, he starts doing his agitation tick that we've seen come up multiple times. And this is in regards to him saying to her that he's sorry. I don't necessarily know if I should hold all the weight to those words now, just due to that even little tell there. It's something that I'm going to keep in mind as I continue forward. And then something interesting that he does verbally and has always done throughout the entirety of the case, which is what pushed many people, even subconsciously, to believe that he was innocent, is that he had no issue bringing light to flaws that he had. So in this situation, he could say, yeah, I was complicit in Kathy's disappearance, which that would be a big red flag for anybody listening, and he had no problem doing that. And that made it to where people would feel, okay, so if he says that, then if he's willingly just admitting that, then maybe that's all that there is. And he's really not lying when he says that he didn't do any actual crimes. Maybe that's the thing that's going on, is it's because he understands how to manage your perception of him by adding credibility to himself by admitting mistakes or flaws. And there's discussion of whether or not he's consciously doing that or not. I do believe that it's something that he might even maybe somewhat unconsciously do, but it's probably something that he's learned over time as he's been in different scenarios and found out how he can best manipulate people. Because something that becomes very blaringly obvious as you continue to dive down the Durst rabbit hole is that he understands how to interact with people to make them feel ways. He's good at it. He's a very solid manipulator. From what I've seen so far, let's continue.
Kathy?
I was the dominant one in the relationship. I was making all the decisions, calling all the shots, as she would say. And, she went along with that for a while, and she just got tired of it. She said she wants her independence. She doesn't want me to be controlling her all the time.
Was there a dividing line when she began that change?
Kathy first started changing from the Kathy I met when I made her get an abortion. I said, I told you from the...
So we're understanding more about Durst's character in this area, because once again, his character, his psychology, how he functions is going to have a heavy hand in what his nonverbal displays are and what some of his trigger points could be. For a controlling person, it would be the point of a lack of control that could send them over the edge into agitation. For somebody who is more safe, maybe they're a little bit less, or they're just more reserved, something like that. It's having that moment pushed of them having to step out of that comfort zone that they're in and really rub them the wrong way. So we're understanding that Durst was very controlling, and he was very open about his controlling nature. He was very self-centered. He had a disgust for the common family. And these are all things that are important to make note of in his character, because they explain some of his strange behavior throughout this trial. Let's continue watching.
Beginning, I didn't want children. You agreed that we wouldn't have children. Now you're telling me you're pregnant, which, you're in charge of that stuff, not me.
That line, now you're pregnant, you're in charge of that stuff, not me. That dismissive verbal pattern there really lets you know kind of his feeling towards even just the day-to-day things that perhaps Kathy would have to go through. From what I understand from Durst's behavioral patterns here is that everything was very, very exclusively his way or the highway. It was about him, he's the best, and that was how he really perceived himself, even down to these points of where he's talking about how he behaved. He's not showing shame, he's not showing guilt, nor is he showing desynchronization between his words and his nonverbal patterns, so that really does lead me to believe that he was very, very self-centered. I am not a psychologist, so I'm not going to diagnose him like in any official level. This is just me speaking to you of things that I've observed about his behavior. It does seem very, very selfish and self-centered, and with a substantial lack of guilt or shame about it. Very interesting things. Let's continue watching.
And you want to keep the baby. Well, you keep the baby, you're going to get divorced from me. Period.
You sound like you were pretty adamant about it. And
I was strictly adamant. I just didn't want kids around. I didn't want to raise children. Somehow I thought it would be a jinx.
That you might be a jinx for them.
Yeah.
Okay. So talking about his feelings, and yes, partially he's fair to express his feelings in the relationship dynamic. There's a healthy way to do that. His isn't that. But now, he's talking about how he is afraid that he's going to be a jinx. He has a very massive tick. His specific tick means he's agitated. From what I'm seeing, everywhere it has meant that he's agitated. So he has his tick going. And then he also does this really substantial self-soothing gesture up here on the side of his head. This is a big, big tell. It hasn't come up anywhere else in this entire interview, and just so you know, there's more than just a little bit that we've gone through. There's a substantial amount more, but I don't want to detract from the actual documentary maker's content, so go watch it. Go watch the Jinx documentary if you would like to see this full interview in the context of everything. So what I've seen here is that across all of this stuff, this tell, the scratching of the head, and it's not like a scratch, like, oh my goodness, I have an itch. It's like a methodical, almost massaging of the scalp that he does here. That comes up in very intense areas of agitation. And so this idea of him being a jinx, something like that for his kids, he'll say here in a second that he doesn't think he would be a good father, really lets us know that his agitation level is substantially high about that. And I wonder if that's because this moment that he's talking about with possibly having a child enter into this dynamic that he adamantly did not want to be there, and then Kathy pulling away from him because he's controlling, I wonder if that's what's causing that big self-soothing tell to pop up there. Very interesting. Let's continue.
I knew I wasn't going to be a good father.
She said the two of you went to a park.
Full disgust across his face with the corners here being raised and this area being crinkled and his eyebrows drawn together and lowered down. That very overt disgust towards him and fatherhood lets us also know how he probably feels in relation to his father. He's very intelligent from what I've understood. No, I don't think anybody's questioned the intelligence of Durst. They've always only questioned why he did what he did, and he is, from what I can see, very, at least even self-aware, which self-awareness is partially an indicator of intelligence. So he's very self-aware of what he's doing and how he's portraying and how he's talking and how he behaves, and it's very interesting to me. Let's continue watching.
And that you were both drunk and you came home, and that was the first time that she remembers that you had hit her. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember the first time I had slapped her or hit her.
Do you remember other times that
Oh, yeah. By 1981, our life was half arguments, fighting, slapping, pushing, wrestling.
So this is just still something that's allowing us to understand his character, who he was, how he behaved, and notice his nonchalant behavior, his relaxed behavior while talking about him being physically abusive to his significant other, and how carelessly he was. And he also does an interesting verbal pattern here. He says slapped or hit, So it's not like they're just doing some like light slapping, which is still very wrong, but he also makes that distinguishing factor between being slapped and likely being hit. And there is a difference. The damage alone is substantially different. But then he goes through and he talks about how they were pushing and they were always fighting, and for him to be so willing to admit that he would regularly abuse his wife is another interesting character trait about Durst. I don't like Durst, but what we can learn from his behavior is still interesting. So for him to so casually do that, it lets us know that he doesn't have a problem with violence on any level. Even physical violence, down to pushing and striking another human. He said it could happen regularly, and he said so without shame or guilt. So that's letting us know what he is at least capable of so far.
It deteriorated from there on. It never got better. It got worse and worse.
So the night that she disappeared, that Sunday night, or the last night that you saw her, do you want to just take me through what you remember happening that night?
She's going to go birdies for a party. She's taking the car. Do I want to come? Not, you want to go to the birdies for a party, but I'm going to go, and I'm taking the car. You can come if you want to come. No, I don't want to come.
So he's getting agitated in the anger realm right now as he's talking about this story where Kathy is more or less going against his apparently infallible personal desires. More or less somebody is pushing against what he wants, and there's probably going to be a substantial repercussion. So during this time, you can hear a little bit of harshness come into his tone as he's talking, as the words themselves just sound sharper. And this is partially due to projection, and this is based off of feeling more impassioned about what he's speaking. AKA, he's feeling genuinely upset about Kathy going against what he wanted. And now we know that he has no issue being physically violent in regards to those instances. This is just not building up to a Kathy disappears situation, at least considering the context. This is more building up to a Kathy has something bad happen to her situation. Let's continue.
That was the weekend. I didn't like that at all.
You told detective
I didn't like that at all. He has a lot of disgust and contempt come into the side of his face, and he kind of hunkers down. It's almost like a defensive anger at somebody infringing on his personal feelings or beliefs or something like that. It's very interesting, and it's genuine there. And just, yeah, you know what? We'll talk a little bit more. We only have 1 minute and 58 seconds of my part of this, the first half, and you know the drill.
Detective struck that the Sunday night that you last saw Kathy, you had dropped her off the station, and then you went to the mayor's for a drink, the neighbors.
Yeah, that's what I told the police. I was hoping that would just make everything go away. I didn't go to the mayor's. I just took her to the train station, went home, and went to sleep.
So this is another thing that we can note now about Durst's behavior, which is still just creating this character sketch of understanding centered around him and allows us to be more accurate as we continue forward, is that he has no problem lying. And this is actually very true. From what I saw during my research, his life was characterized by flippantly lying to better or ease his life, regardless of what it would take. And regardless of the stakes even down to, which it won't be included in this video. If you do request it, I can include it at the end of the very end of the next video. Even down at the very, very last moments. As he's riddled with cancer, he admits calmly and coolly to the judge that he would very willingly lie under oath to better himself. That he would have no problem doing that. And then they ask him, so how can we trust what you're saying? In that you just said you would lie to make sure that you're taken care of, how can we know that you're not lying about any of this stuff? And he doesn't have an answer for that, because there's not an answer to that, because I do kind of believe, at least from what we're seeing, that he probably was lying. But, I mean, this is an opinion side. I want to show you the scientific part first, so we'll talk more about that a little bit later.
And why would that have made everything go away?
Well, I'm at the mayor's. They wanted to hear, what did you do? So I told them I did that. I just
Big pushing away kind of gesture. Could be signaling that he's trying to indicate distance, and then also I did that, and that's also indicating distance as well. And so his drive in this, specifically even this instance, from what he was saying, is that he wanted people to not pay attention to him. He wanted to wash his hands of it and move on, which is in and of itself a very telling dynamic. His wife is missing, and he just kind of wanted to wash his hands of it. And that was kind of what drove him. Very interesting. But then, this is what ended up making it, I don't know, frustrating is the word, but intriguing for sure for me, is that we could now see him say a thing, and he so flippantly admits that he lies about it. And that's concerning for a nonverbal analyst, to see somebody so calmly, collectedly, and rather unremarkably lie. That means that it's going to be work to catch out a lie in this situation. But it's just, it's very interesting.
It just never got through my mind. It was like a negotiation. You tell somebody something, and well, that's it. They don't go back there. They don't look for motive. And why is he telling me this kind of thing? I thought that would get them to, leave me alone, accept the missing person like that.
There was some discussion about that you spoke to her at some point.
Yes, that was the last part of my, the police are going to leave you alone now. I said, I called her, and I said I stopped at a payphone on the way home.
I called her, and then he does a substantial dry swallow in there, but still very fixated on this police leaving him alone. And I think that's the genuine part of his recollection, is that he was indeed very interested in getting the police to leave him alone. He doesn't give a reason for that, but I think the reason for that is because he was complicit in it. But he does another just casual admittance of lying to law enforcement so that they would leave him alone, of being like, yeah, and then I also said I called her, and I never did, which you'll see that soon here. He said, the interviewer asked her, did you call her? And he says no. So he's just so calm and collected about lying. Let's see that happen.
Or I went out for a walk later, and I called her from the payphone. She answered the phone, and that puts her in the city, and they're going to leave me alone now.
Did you end up speaking to her that night?
No.
So you hear about this
Interesting. That actually had his tail, his big agitation tail. No. And it's pretty massive, so something about that caused some agitation for him. I actually didn't notice this until right now. I didn't notice that he has that there. And I don't know that he didn't talk to her that night. I don't know that I doubt he called her, but I don't know that he didn't talk to her. And that would also, no, actually, that wouldn't make sense. So that agitation is still there. Not sure why it is. I was thinking that perhaps he was showing that agitation because it could be an indicator that he did see her or speak to her, maybe in person, right before something went poorly perhaps, but I'm not sure that even fits in the timeline, so I'm making sure that I don't misspeak while I talk about this. So let's continue.
Investigation, you read the article.
And it blew me away. Absolutely, totally blew me away. I wasn't the least bit concerned about the details. The divers searched the lake until you're blue in the face. You took a wall out of the house. Ridiculous.
What were the divers for?
Obviously.
I'm pausing it right here because he's talking about an article that came out, kind of talking about some of the details of things, and he was saying it was preposterous and blah, blah, blah. And the divers were looking in the lake. This is a really interesting detail that I haven't seen anybody bring up quite yet, but I think might be fairly telling, but I don't know the context, so not fully. So just precursing this. The interviewer asked Durst what were they looking for in the lake, and obviously this is in regards to Kathy. Let's hear what his response is.
They're looking for body parts, looking for something that can be used as evidence. But what they don't announce is what they found.
And that's the end of this video for today. I know, a little bit of a cliffhanger, and that is because I would really like you to watch the second half of this where everything comes to fruition, and there's so much that happens in the second episode. I wanted to fit it into today's, but this one's already long, so we're going to keep it a little bit shorter today. So the divers were diving in search of what? And now if there's a missing person, what would your response be? Anybody else? Any other single human being with no history of any form of violence or possibilities of murder or anything like that? Your response would be, oh, I'm assuming they're looking for a body, for Kathy's body, right? Her body. Durst interestingly mentions body parts. Not evoked by the interviewer from what we can see. And this is where the context is really going to be the crucial part. Because say this was unrelated to anything, like the interviewer doesn't mention body parts, nothing has mentioned body parts before this that we're not even privy to perhaps, and then he says body parts, well, that's really fascinating because, you know, in a later crime from this one, he mentions that he dismembered a body parts. And now if we rewind, he's using the same verbal pattern of body parts, which is not what the answer should be. It shouldn't be body parts. It should most certainly be just a body. Why would you also assume that it's also dismembered? Unless you have some reason to believe that. And if that's the case, then that would make Morris Black the second body that we know of that Durst dismembered. And so we're going to continue this in the next episode. Let me know what you think so far, with what you see so far from the information I've been able to find for you, track down, and deliver to you. What are your opinions on this? I have some very interesting ones forming, and we'll talk about them at the end of the next episode. So yeah, that's where we're at now. This video is partnered with the Emotional Intelligence Academy out of the UK. It's where you can go and receive world top tier education on nonverbal communication and high stakes nonverbal reading. It's a really good class. I'm going through their classes as well, and so I highly suggest you check it out. There's a link in the description of this video and every video that if you go to the landing page that they've set up for me, we are partnered. If you go to that landing page and sign up for their classes using the form that's on that page, you'll receive a pretty okay discount, even at the lower end. At the lower end, you'll get maybe around 10%, and then on some courses, like the Getting to the Truth, it's a very substantial discount just from being a fan of the channel here. So if you would like to be able to do that, if you appreciate what I do, then check it out. That's gonna be probably your easiest way to do that, to step down this career path, because it's a new one, very, very untread ground. There's a lot of things to discover, and so if you would like to be able to do that, that's the best way to do it. But without further ado, that's all that I've got for the day. My name is Logan, and you have been oh so awesome as you always are, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys.